指定暴力団山口組6代目組長の
What you've
塚
got
田
here
忍
is
こと 篠
the
田健
welcoming
一元
committee
受刑
when
者は
the boss
今
of
日午前
Yamaguchi
5時
Gumi,
50分
Japan's largest
関
gang,
係者らに
got
迎えら
out
れ
of prison
東京
a
府
few
中市
years
の
ago.
府中刑務所から出所しました。
It attracted quite a
配下の
stir
組員に
amongst
拳
the
銃を
press
持
and
たせた
people
罪
who
に問
follow
われ
such things.
2005年に最高
Interesting
裁
that
で
after
懲役6年の刑が
Tsukasa
確定し
got out of
服役
prison, he gave a lengthy interview and in which he spoke at length. And one of the really telling things is he was asked about the effect of the Japanese government's new anti-Yakuza ordinances that they had implemented. And he said, what he said was, "We'll adjust."
We will adjust.
And that's right. And that was very telling because the Yakuza are flexible, nimble, and some of Japan's best entrepreneurs.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit, gentlemen, about the other roles that, focusing initially on Japan, on the Yakuza, other roles in society that they play. And Charlie, have you got some kind of thoughts on this? What else do they do?
Well, I mean, I'm thinking back through history. If you talk about traditional organized crime in the United States versus the Yakuza today, here in Hawaii, for instance, I don't see a lot of violence associated with Yakuza here.
Wait a minute, are you saying the Yakuza is here in Hawaii?
Oh, sure. Sure, they have interests here.
Okay.
In fact, Yakuza, in terms of the United States, they've had some limited influence in states like California and the West Coast, and maybe even some associations in New York and places like that. But their main interest in the United States, I think would be fair to say it's here in Hawaii.
Well, we'll come back to this. What's the organized crime component here in Hawaii a little bit later in the show.
Okay.
What other roles do they play in society in Japan that you've had experience with or observed?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking me, but and you know, really maybe Grant would be, since he's lived in Japan, he would be better equipped to answer that. But Yakuza in Japan play very much the same sort of role, first of all, as organized crime in the United States in trying to influence politics and that sort of thing, but also controlling criminal interests there, whether it might be gambling, prostitution, drugs, to a certain extent, money laundering, just a wide range of criminal activities. But also, not only that, they also have a lot of legitimate interests as well. I mean, with your ill-gotten gains, you have to do something with the money that you earn.
Right.
So they end up, just as they have here in the United States, buying legitimate business, running legitimate business, and so we see that here in Hawaii as well as in Japan.
Grant, can you add to this point about kind of the role of the Yakuza in Japanese society? What else do they do other than this extensive list that Charlie has laid out, which is
they do several things. Certain politicians would, in general, would look at Yakuza actually as almost sort of a support group or a political action committee, where the Yakuza provide block votes. They provide information with which to blackmail other people and to prevent yourself from getting blackmailed. And they provide money and funding. And in return, traditionally, the Yakuza would get public works contracts. It sort of recycles itself. The origins of that actually go back to the Meiji era in the 19th century. They play a dispute resolution role.
oh, the lawyers will enjoy this.
Well,
Go ahead.
Well, there's so few lawyers in Japan, but there's just as many disputes between Japanese as there are anyone else. And the Yakuza actually play a role that lawyers would play in a lot of other places. I heard once that in Kyushu, for example, that most companies of any scale would actually have a Yakuza on the payroll in order to deal with problems with customers and other companies.
Right.
And there's a professor at University of Michigan, or he was a while back, Mark West, who actually did very enlightening work on this. And the third thing I would note is that Yakuza actually play the role of Silicon Valley.
What?
There's no venture capital business in Japan because if someone has a good idea, needs to get funding, if he goes to a bank, they will tell him, well, the exit is over here, sir. And so, but Japanese have just as many good ideas as anyone else. If you need funding, well, the Yakuza have a ton of money, and as I said, these guys are nimble entrepreneurs who can spot an opportunity. So they would actually be the guys who lend money to these starting people with ideas, the startup companies, the venture capital.
All right, well, let me jump on this idea, because this is fascinating to me. Is this venture capital investment work, the Yakuza Venture Capital Association, if you will, do they invest in startups outside of Japan?
I've never heard of that. I just don't know. You know, I've not heard of it. So.
Clearly, the Yakuza in Japan is much more widely accepted and open in their society than, for instance, traditional organized crime in the United States. They're almost a, if you will, a component, political component. That's not to say that in the United States, traditional organized crime doesn't try to influence politics, for instance, but they just don't do it as openly as Yakuza because of the regard in which they're held in this country, the mobs, the syndicates, and that sort of thing. But believe me, through labor unions and racketeering, they definitely try to influence elections, politicians, and the full range that Yakuza does, traditional organized crime in the U.S. does as well.
Let me bring up, go ahead, Grant.
Yes, Yakuza do have to be careful, and they don't flaunt what they are when they are involved in the political end of it. But you're right, it is very different than it is in the United States. Also, when it is revealed, for example, that a politician does have Yakuza ties, and somehow it just can't be hidden, or the press has to look at it, it does cause a fuss. And under the Noda administration, which was the previous prime minister, the justice minister, about 3 weeks after he took office, it was discovered he was pretty good friends with the Yakuza. This created a fuss, and he did have to step down. But Charlie's right that it's nowhere near as hidden as it is in the United States.
Well, one of the things that is interesting is that, and let me ask the control room if you would queue up video 1B ready to go. And let me just say to the audience here, while that's going on, that you see scenes in Japan that underscore how open the Yakuza is as a part of society here. And so here's a scene that was shot, and let's go ahead and roll this piece, where a major crime boss is arriving in his Rolls Royce there. Got a wonderful greeting, and we got a nice close-up shot of the gentleman there.